Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, every, everyone. Yes, sorry. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to 2021 webinar series on the interpretation of heritage, titled World Heritage and Multiple Memories, hosted by Cultural Heritage Administration of Republic of Korea. I am Harry Shim from the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. The Preparatory Office is an organizer of this event and a UNESCO Category 2 center carrying out researching, networking, and capacity building in the field of heritage interpretation. The center will be officially established by end of this year. We organized this webinar series to identify new issues related to multi-layered narratives and sometimes conflicting interpretations of history that are attached to world heritage. Because since adopting the convention, heritage conservation has focused more on protecting physical authenticity of heritage. However, we can see from the cases like Hagia Sophia reverting to mosque, or Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution sites, which contains various histories, there is a rising interest on multiple narratives due to diverse stakeholder groups and community engagement in heritage management. So we plan to offer a series of discussions to talk about how to protect our heritage and to manage the conflict in this multi-dimensional society. Facing 50th anniversary of World Heritage Convention next year, I think this series will raise timely questions and provide good discussion for a better protection of our heritage. 2021 webinar series is composed of 6 webinars, particularly on the theme of heritage and memory, taking place every month with different experts from February till July. The first session is today. The discussant will be talking about new approaches to World Heritage conservation, World Heritage interpretation and presentation. And next month, we're going to deal with dissonance on World Heritage, multiple voices with different memories. In April, we're going to have a discussion about contested multiple memories on World Heritage sites with 3 specific cases. And we're also going to launch a video contest on the theme of peace and reconciliation through World Heritage. And we're going to talk about the submitted works around the world at the 4th webinar in May. In June, we are going to look for answers to the questions that we have raised through this journey, discussing the institutional aspects, including the role of UNESCO and the civil society approaches. Finally, the last webinar will be taking place as a side event of coming 44th World Heritage Committee on the theme of multiple voices and memories toward peace building and reconciliation. The webinar series is in collaboration with the African World Heritage Fund, also a UNESCO Category 2 center in the field of World Heritage in Africa. We expect this webinar series to serve as a forum for discussing the peaceful management of World Heritage in conflict and the effective implementation of World Heritage Convention. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Christina Cameron. Dr. Cameron is a professor emeritus in the School of Architecture at the University of Montreal. She has been involved with the UNESCO World Heritage Program for more than 30 years and has been a chair for the World Heritage Committee twice. She also has a long history in the government of Canada in the field of heritage, including the head of the Canadian delegation of UNESCO World Heritage Committee. And recently, she is one of the chairs leading the global awareness-raising initiative called Our World Heritage, redefining the role of heritage in a multidimensional world. Before beginning our webinar, I would like to let you know that you can leave your comments or questions on our Facebook or YouTube below this video during the webinar. There will be Q&A session after the discussion, so please share your thoughts. Now I would like to turn the time over to our moderator. Pleasure to meet you, Christina.
Thank you, Hari, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our audience, and welcome to this first in the series of webinars organized by the Preparatory Office on the theme of World Heritage, Multiple Memories. Today, our session is on new approaches to World Heritage conservation with a particular focus on the role of interpretation and presentation. In this webinar, we've been invited to discuss the international context related to interpretation and presentation of World Heritage, especially through the lens, of multiple memories. So to put our conversation in context, I want to make 2 points. The first is that the 1972 World Heritage Convention says that a site proposed for World Heritage listing must meet the threshold or the standard of outstanding universal value. This means that the focus is on universality and therefore does not always reflect the multiple narratives often associated with historic places. The second point that I wanted to make is that in the early years, a lot of attention was paid to the physical condition and conservation of sites. And I think we could argue today that interpreting diverse values and reflecting multiple voices at World Heritage sites has become as significant as physical conservation. So what we have then is an interplay of official narratives, like the universality narrative, and other narratives. This can occur in historic sites, and it can also occur in natural parks and protected areas. Multiple narratives come from different memories associated with the same place. Because different individuals and groups have different memories associated with the same site, it's obvious that multiple narratives can sometimes be dissonant, leading to disagreements and even, indeed, conflict. So to explore these issues today, we are fortunate to have 3 very knowledgeable discussants from the United States, Korea, and Australia, and I invite them to turn on their cameras. First, let me introduce Elizabeth Silks. Welcome, Elizabeth. As the Executive Director of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, Elizabeth guides the strategic growth of a thriving consortium of 300 museums, historic sites, and memory initiatives in 65 countries. The coalition supports sites of conscience across the globe in developing innovative civic engagement, transitional justice, and human rights programs through exhibits, designs, peer learning exchanges, project grants, and joint advocacy initiatives. Her extensive experience with community-based memory and media projects gives her a unique perspective on the power of the personal story to move audiences from past to present and from memory to action. As a featured speaker at conferences and workshops around the world, Elizabeth has spoken about the role of memory in creating lasting cultures of peace and human rights in post-conflict settings and emerging democracies. Our next discussant is Ji-Hun Lim. He's a professor of transactional history and director of the Critical Global Studies Institute of Sogang University in Seoul. He has published widely on nationalism and Marxism, Polish history, transnational history, and global memory. Among his recent works are the 5 volumes in the Palgrave series of Mass Dictatorship in the 20th Century. And he was a series editor for that. And he's now the principal investigator of the international research project Mnemonic Solidarity, Colonization, War, and Genocide in the Global Memory Space, and series editor of Entangled Memories in the Global South. His recent memory studies books include Memory War, How Could Perpetrators Become Victims? And Mnemonic Solidarity Global Interventions. and he has 2 other books in progress. As a memory activist, as he describes himself, he has co-curated exhibits on unwelcome neighbors and one on naming forced laborers. And he also serves as president of the Network of Global and World History Organizations. And our third discussant is Olwen Beasley, a heritage professional who currently works for the New South Wales state government in Australia, managing a team that supports the governance and management arrangements for 3 World Heritage Sites. And they are Willandra Lakes region, the Greater Blue Mountains area, and the Gondwana rainforest. As part of this role, she has worked to support and improve Aboriginal representation in the governance and management of World Heritage properties, and worked closely with the traditional owners of the Willandra Lakes region World Heritage Site to develop a rights-based approach to research on country and to achieve the repatriation of ancestral remains. Olwen started her working career as a field archaeologist in the United Kingdom, and then moved to Australia to do a master's degree in heritage conservation at Sydney University. Her doctoral work at the Australian National University focused on associative intangible cultural heritage values, including places of memory, on the World Heritage List using Criterion 6. For several years, she supported Australia's role on the World Heritage Committee and now serves as the inaugural chair of the Australian Convict Sites Steering Committee, that being another World Heritage Site. So welcome all 3. And starting with Elizabeth, I have asked each discussant to make a brief positioning statement related to the theme using only one image. And after that, we'll have a discussion among ourselves, and then near the end, we'll move to the question and answer period. So I invite you, Elizabeth, to make your brief positioning statement.
Thank you, Christina. It is a pleasure to be here this evening. From my perspective, heritage sites at their best are truth tellers. They come alive through the power of the stories they hold, but those stories don't necessarily unfold organically or fully, especially those that are complex, contested, or divisive, as most indeed are. Yet, if those stories aren't harnessed in the service of truth-telling, heritage sites can deepen divides, reinforce faults or revisionist narratives, or reopen old wounds, rather than be a force for good, for new perspectives, for new understandings. To ensure that heritage sites harness their power for good, the full story of a site must be shared in all its complexity, leaving room for evolving understandings, all of which calls for interpretation that is inclusive, grounded in and emerging from a multiplicity of experiences. To begin such a process, we might look at a site's programs, exhibits, interpretation, and ask, who is missing? Whose voice should be centered here? Is it women, Indigenous community members, victims of violence and oppression? And if we don't see such stories, how can we ultimately engage society in protecting these sites if the stories they tell don't reflect a plurality of experiences, whether long past or present day, because conservation is ultimately about that engagement, those connections. We see in this slide just a few examples of sites of conscience that are also World Heritage Sites. Among them, Monticello in the United States, which tells the story of Thomas Jefferson, but also, and only recently, tells the story of Sally Hemings, who, as his slave, bore Thomas's children. You also see Le Bois du Casier in Belgium, which shares its history of migrant labor, but also hosts programs about racism and xenophobia today. And at the bottom of the slide, you see Bagan in Myanmar. It was named a World Heritage Site in 2019. The committee noted at that time, Bagan is a sacred landscape featuring an exceptional range of Buddhist art and architecture. This was mere months after the United Nations investigators declared that Myanmar's military had for years been carrying out mass killings of minority Rohingya Muslims with genocidal intent. But as you see from the tweet just last week in the center of that bottom row, there really is no way to wall off heritage from conflict. Activists protested the military coup currently unfolding in Myanmar by marching at Bagan and using its status as a World Heritage Site to demand their rights. Yes, it is hard work telling divisive histories, but it is essential. Anyone in a position of deciding which stories are told might pause to consider how they came to be in that role. How did the system work in their favor to place them in that privileged position? At its core, then, this discussion is about power, about who chooses what stories are told. By selecting only the stories that might be told more comfortably about a site's history, by choosing not to reflect the full history, including contested memories, we're no longer working in the service of truth-telling. We're perpetuating the inequitable power structures that led to those contested memories in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was very inspiring. Our next speaker to present his positioning statement is Ji-Hun Lim, and I invite you, Professor Lim, to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for very kind introduction of me. And in a sense, my position is very similar to Elizabeth's position about the sites of the conscience. From a viewpoint of memory activists and also global memory studies scholar, I would pinpoint two special points in the interpreting and reinterpreting world heritage in the 21st century. I think that one of the characteristics of the globalization in this century is that the focus of discourse regarding globalization begin to shift from imagination to memory. So one can say this is a century for the globalization of memory. So this is why the World Heritage Sites becomes more and more important. It has a really carries a multi-directional meanings to different groups in the world. And second point is that a sort of emergence of moral remembrance in the global memory formation. So, I mean, the remembrance is not the certain positivistic process, or it's not a certain just for in search of certain accurate past. It involves always a sort of a moral estimation and the moralistic the interpretation of the past. So these two facts, I mean, the 2 points, this a globalization of memory and then moral remembrance might be involved in our work of reinterpreting World Heritage Sites in this century. And this photo is taken by my friend, Reinhard Kessler, who is working on the German memory on Namibia, especially this a German memory of colonial genocide in the first decade of the 20th century. And these ladies, they are delegates from Namibia to negotiate over the repatriate the human bones in Charité Hospital in Berlin. So while they were visiting Berlin, they were just having a rest on the famous Holocaust memorial in Berlin. Some may feel that this photo intrude one's own very sacred memories, but on the other hand, some may feel that, oh, this shows a certain connectivity of different memories in the 21st century. So how can we really connect or combine suffering of one group to the suffering and a memory of the other group? So I think that this is very symptomatic of the emergence of global memory space or global memory formation in 21st century. So I think that when we try to reinterpret and interpret World Heritage Sites in 21st century, I think that if we carry the certain spirit behind this photo, we might have a quite interesting new approach to World Heritage sites. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ji-Hoon. Very interesting. And now I'm asking the Alwyn Beasley. If Alwyn, could you make your positioning statement? Thank you. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
Yes, thanks very much. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land of which I'm standing today in Wollongong in Australia, the First Nations Dharawal people. I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the loss of land, cultures, and life due to colonial settlement in Australia. We meet today to talk about World Heritage presentation and interpretation, and in doing so, I include recognition of First Nations peoples' unbreakable connection and responsibility to country, including country where World Heritage properties are located. So this slide I have up has the sort of position title, Sustainable World Heritage Interpretation, Inclusion of Multiple Voices, Multiple Memories, and Multiple Values. And I've chosen this slide because I think it really encapsulates the challenge that, that we have in telling the full stories and all the values of World Heritage properties in the modern day. So this is a cave called Hang En Cave at Phong Nha, Khe Bang National Park in central Vietnam. The cave on the left is the second largest cave in the world. And on the right, we see a local indigenous woman carrying wood, resources from the World Heritage property. She comes from one of two minority groups and the smallest ethnic groups in Vietnam, the Ma Kung and the Ruk. And they live in two villages in the World Heritage property currently. Where the conflict comes is that, you know, I visited this site and there was no interpretation of the indigenous people and their connection to country and their role in managing the land. And indeed, there was very little interpretation about the biodiversity values and the geological values for which the site was listed. And so maybe there is just a larger piece of interpretation work to be done at this site, and this will all come to the fore. But what is slightly concerning is that apparently the government, you know, have sought to relocate the villagers and give them new homes, which of course they have been avoiding. And the reason for that is because of their use of the resources in the World Heritage property. And so when we look at the central point of multiple memories, minority voices, and multiple values at World Heritage properties, I think this slide encapsulates that point. I'd like to continue my introduction by explaining what I mean by sustainable World Heritage interpretation. And really there, I'm talking about how it supports the aims of UNESCO's Sustainable Development Policy and how it relates to the inclusion of multiple voices in interpretation. The UNESCO Sustainable Development Policy states that there should specifically be, and I quote, full respect and participation of all stakeholders and right holders, including Indigenous peoples and local communities, in relation to World Heritage. And I believe very strongly that this should also specifically apply to World Heritage interpretation. The policy identifies that states parties to the Convention should adopt a rights-based approach which promotes World Heritage properties as exemplar places for application of the highest standards for the respect and realization of human rights. My personal view is that for a rights-based approach to be effectively adopted, interpretation should fall under the rubric of management and therefore be considered central to the project of World Heritage by states parties at the time of nomination. What this would do is ensure the inclusion of multiple voices, narratives, memories, and values in a nomination document, whether or not they were of outstanding universal value, and therefore allow for their effective inclusion in subsequent interpretation in or about the property. It could be a challenge for some properties that do not want to reflect multiple and sometimes painful minority narratives within the dominant state narrative proposed for nomination to the World Heritage List. These are some of the issues that I have no doubt will be teased out in this webinar, in our discussions, or in subsequent webinars in this series. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. It's very interesting, and it's the contrast that I was setting up at the beginning between outstanding universal value and other values, that the drive of the World Heritage Convention pushes you in that direction. So thank you. You've all, whoops, your lights. Everybody's opening statements, and now as your moderator, I have a few questions that I'd like to table and get your views on. The first one is about the World Heritage Convention, which was created in 1972, and it's now, of course, almost 50 years old. And in reflecting on that, I'd be interested to hear your view, and this is for Alwyn, since you've studied World Heritage in your PhD, what you think is the main focus, what has been the main focus in implementing the convention, and where are the gaps? What has been overlooked?
Thank you, Christina. I'll take the first part of the question, what has been the main focus of implementing the convention first. So that I think really the main focus in the implementation of the convention in the early years was the preoccupation of states parties to have properties in their territories identified and inscribed on the World Heritage List. So that was, a real major focus. And of course, today we have over 1,000 inscriptions on the World Heritage List. The reason this was a focus is because even today, World Heritage listing is seen as a highly desirable designation by states parties, and it provides them with prestige. More recently, of course, World Heritage designation has been recognised as important to encourage tourism and therefore economic development, but that wasn't the focus in the early days. And I suppose the main issue with the focus being on inscription was that after inscription, states parties tended not to look at the detailed management challenges of having a property on the World Heritage List. It was almost as though one had the site listed and then rested on one's laurels and said, well, this is wonderful. We have a World Heritage site that's been recognised by the world, and that's great. Let's look at listing the next one. So there has always been a requirement for the identification, protection, conservation, presentation, and transmission to future generations of heritage of outstanding universal value identified in the convention. But the concept of management planning had not yet been developed. And this is where the focus on listing was prioritized over management, and then for later on down the track, which I'll come to, about interpretation. There was also, as Christina has identified, a clear focus on conservation of the physical fabric or on particular species management for natural heritage sites, but a more nuanced approach to take into account social, economic and environmental roles of World Heritage in society in the early days wasn't really broadly considered. And so we can see that we've come a very long way from where we started in 1972 in the discussion that we're having today and has been being had around the world at this time. Also, I'd like to point out that the responsibilities and obligations of states parties to manage and protect the outstanding universal value, the World Heritage values and attributes of those properties, is something that has come later in the piece, and really that's been enhanced and drawn out by the requirement to provide management planning systems that identify how those values would be protected moving forward. So I think those are the main areas of what the focus used to be. And so the second point of the question is, what areas have been overlooked? I think that it can be said that the broader management, other than the conservation of the fabric or of the threatened species or the ecosystems, the management was, as I've said, secondary to the nomination. And now, of course, they are the focus of a lot of the work of states parties and are required as part of the nomination process. But I think the question for us is, what that has meant for interpretation at World Heritage properties in the past, that it wasn't initially seen as a high priority, and perhaps even now is not considered as with the same level of importance at some places as management planning is. And so again, there's privileging of some aspects of the World Heritage Convention over others. And I think this is why we've come to the point where we are today to discuss these plural voices and plural values, which are nuanced within a World Heritage inscription. I think also that with the issue of interpretation being possibly subsidiary and possibly seen as an add-on to World Heritage responsibilities, that this, is something that needs to be considered in future inscriptions and the management of properties, and that I would suggest that it actually should be a driver for states parties to the World Heritage Convention, and should be seen as integral to the nomination process, which currently it isn't.
Mhm.
And I think, that's problematic, because when a site's inscribed, one really should be thinking about what the values are, whether outstanding universal value or local or national values, and how all of those values can be explained and told in the interpretation process. And then I suppose just to finish up, with the focus of World Heritage inscription being on outstanding universal values, that these other values have been sometimes omitted from nomination dossiers, or if included in nomination dossiers, they haven't worked through into the interpretation of a property. And that means that the local and national values are minimized or totally excluded. And in doing that, so often other stories and memories of the people with rights and interests in the property who are not central to the outstanding universal value. And this is where we get to this point again of why it's important to discuss these multiple memories.
Yeah, in a funny way, the fact that the convention had culture and nature as separate parts means that in both sides, actually, that the full values were not described. There are a lot of national parks and natural parks and protected areas that have been listed that have strong, strong human stories. And they were never, it was all about the species or about the volcanoes or the mountains or whatever. And the human stories are not there, to speak to your point. So in 50 years, the world has changed a lot. And so we probably do need new approaches and perspectives to protect and present World Heritage in this world. And I guess I would ask you to speak to what you might suggest as new approaches and why. And perhaps, Ji-Hun, we could start with you if you'd like to step up on that one.
Okay, thank you. See, first of all, I have to recognize that my knowledge on the World Heritage sites is very much limited regionally to East Asia and Eastern Europe. So with my experience, with my knowledge on East Asia and Eastern Europe, I would say with some exaggeration, World Heritage sites have been interpreted by the nation state actor without the world. Actually, in the name of World Heritage Sites, the nation state, the main actor of the World Heritage promoter, tends to interpret World Heritage as a sort of national achievement to show the other world. So I think that with the globalization of memory, that sort of the spirit or attitude to the World Heritage Sites can be changed into a more globalized one, or to recognize certain interconnectedness, even on the local memory site or national memory sites. Actually, the recent development in the global history writing or entangled memories have shown to us that our past has been entangled much closer than we used to think. So even the local historical sites has carried certain multiple values and multiple meanings, and actually in which the other parts of the world has been involved in making this sort of local and national sites. So this sort of entangledness of the past might give us one clue to understanding World Heritage sites in a different way. The second point is that we need to, encourage the non-state actors to involve in this interpreting World Heritage sites. Because usually it was a nation state, especially in East Asia and in Eastern Europe, which promoted World Heritage sites in the UNESCO or in any global international organizations and meetings. So, but if a nation state has a monopoly in the promoting this sort of World Heritage sites internationally, I think that the sort of conflict between any national interest and the World Heritage, the outstanding values, is in a sense inevitable. So how to promote non-state actors in promoting World Heritage sites is also a very important factor. The other one is, as far as the sort of World Heritage sites in the nature is concerned, I think that we need to think of the spirit of Anthropocene. Usually, if we put a stress on the human beings' involvement in conserving nature or in the contacting nature, I think that a sort of human being-centered interpretation is inevitable. Some people say that this is a human beings' imperialism or human beings' colonialism against the other species and the nature. So how can we really overcome this sort of human beings, a sort of hegemonic approach to the natural World Heritage sites might be also another challenge we can meet in this century. That's all.
Thank you. Do either of you, Elizabeth, would you have any comments on that?
No, I'll just add that I absolutely agree that broadening the net, if you will, so that non-state actors have more of a formal and informal role in interpretation, that's absolutely essential. And it is at the moment when it's a top-down process, it really exclusive, and it's one that does not create access points for vulnerable community members, for those who have negative experiences of these sites. But those experiences are so important in presenting a full story. So I completely agree. And also taking this moment and thinking about our interconnectedness as we're all understanding, I think, in a new way as we look at current public health challenges, and how until all of us can be safe, none of us is safe. This is really, we really are connected in ways that many of us had never really thought before. And when it comes to our stories, untangling through these interpretations and through sites, that's really an extraordinary way for us to begin to identify our shared humanity. And that ultimately is the goal, isn't it, in remembering?
Alwyn, did you have a comment on that? Or did I actually, I was going to make a reflection myself on the fact that the UNESCO, the 1972 convention has no mention, as you say, it's a state party convention, and there's no mention of civil society. And it is interesting that the 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage has a lot of reference to civil society and individuals and groups. So there's that reflects the change that happened. Alwyn.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I'd like to, support everything the previous discussants have raised. And I suppose, as somebody who works in World Heritage, I think another challenge or a perspective that we need to think about in protecting World Heritage today, it is based on the people-centered approach to heritage, but it's also one where we need to engage the public in World Heritage. And Elizabeth's referred to, the current pandemic. And I think the protection of ecosystems and what national parks and World Heritage properties has been really central to the well-being of humanity in this current pandemic, being able to use national parks and World Heritage properties as a space of fresh air and exercise. So there is the sort of the physicality of the properties as well that I think we need to embrace. And by including a people-centered approach, whether that's Indigenous people, local communities who live around the boundaries of a World Heritage property, you know, who have been using that site probably for generations before it was listed, including their stories, and letting them be represented in the interpretation at a place will encourage, you know, it's an age-old adage, but, you know, it will encourage understanding, and through understanding, appreciation, and through appreciation, protection. And, you know, this is the center of the philosophy of national parks, you know, winning hearts and minds. And I think for World Heritage, it's the same. And if we can connect the two elements of a people-centered approach to interpretation in our World Heritage properties, then people will see themselves, they will enjoy, you know, the protection, they will enjoy the resources. And I think we have to also, you know, remember that people do use these places as recreational resources. You know, they go for walks, they have weddings, they go to concerts. You know, it's part of everyday, pre-COVID, everyday life in experiencing, you know, the heritage of humanity. So I think we must be careful not to be too rarefied about our heritage, and try and bring it, as the convention says, have a life in the community, and what that actually means. So through interpretation, but and recognizing that it is a resource as well.
Mhm. Yes, we've certainly seen all the public spaces well used in this last year. The paths are heavily trodden. Shifting gears a bit, I want to go to the telling stories at World Heritage Sites, and how we should do that. What are the principles underlying interpretation? How should we approach interpretation at World Heritage Sites in our time? Elizabeth, do you want to start this one off?
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I love thinking about this. And the principles, really, if they're grounded in local needs and local priorities, then that's a good place to start. Thinking about local traditions as well. And, you know, storytelling can be signage, but it could also be an art project. It could be oral histories. It can be intergenerational dialogues. I think part of the challenge, if one has been working with a traditional approach to World Heritage for a long time, part of the challenge is releasing any sense that you can, in fact, control the stories that emerge, that there is an interpretive plan that feels right and you want to put it forward. Because in the end, we really must be bold and release any expectation that the stories will reflect a single narrative, reflect well on many in the community. When we open up sites for multiple perspectives and essentially multiple truths to emerge, something organic begins happening, and it's much, much farther reaching than the site itself. It's a way for community members to come together and listen in a new way. It's about access, it's about understanding, it's about compassion. We have an opportunity through sites to bring in marginalized members of the community, descendants of those who experienced sites, and really give them an opportunity to share their perspectives. I think I've seen extraordinary art-based programs. I've seen extraordinary dialogue-based programs, which is really about listening rather than about telling your story. And when we can start from the place of listening with compassion, really extraordinary changes can happen within a community. I would also say thinking about partners outside of the site management is really essential. Thinking about schools, thinking about community-based organizations, thinking about family members, victims groups, survivors, elder communities. How can that interconnectedness start at the site and work out from the site? And then ideally, in our work, we also see connecting using virtual means from one site in one location to another in another region that's facing similar challenges. And that's really, I think, an extraordinary way to elevate the stories being told, because it shows that global connection. And ultimately, that's really the goal.
You've all made the point already, but it does, this issue of the national narrative or the dominant universal, outstanding universal value message really works against that, because it makes the site manager feel as if he or she has to give all of those themes from that outstanding universal value statement, that's what they are there to do. And that's absolutely it's the polar opposite of what you've just described, which is interesting. Ji-Hoon, would you like to add on to that?
You know, I do absolutely agree with Liz and all when they talked of the absence of the women and the indigenous people and other subalterns in the World Heritage. But actually, they have been always present in the site. Just what has been absent was our gaze to recognize their presence. Because in a sense, national narratives made us blind to the non-nationally dominant people's groups, a presence in the World Heritage Site. For example, when we have a very close look at the list of so-called national treasures in East Asia, we can see that many of those national treasures are actually imported goods. They were not made in Korea, made in Japan. They were imported from Central Asia and other places. Once we begin to recognize these national treasures actually were produced outside the nation and or in any other part of the world, then people may begin to change their attitude in understanding their own past. Also, architecture. A very famous, eminent national architecture that was built 1,000 years ago. Sometimes we see that, oh, this architecture was built by Gastarbeiters more than 1,000 years ago. But people just presume that, oh, this architecture was made in Korea or made by Koreans. But it's not true. So I mean that once we recognize that this national architecture has been built by the guest workers more than 1,000 years ago, it may lead us to understanding today's Gastarbeiters' importance and their position in our contemporary world. In that way, these different regions in the past has been interconnected. Also, the 1,000 years ago past and present has been interconnected through our gaze or through our ways of understanding what the heritage sites. This I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alwyn, would you like to make a comment?
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to add a little example from Australia, and I'm sure there's a lot of work going on around the world, but of course I'm more familiar with the Australian examples. So the National Trust of Australia, for example, has got a very interesting handbook about how to enable and empower Indigenous peoples in Western Australia to tell the stories of their heritage. And of course, the rock art of the Burrup Peninsula is now on the tentative list for World Heritage listing. And so that again gives strength to the purpose of letting go, as Elizabeth said, which I love that idea of, letting go of the narrative that one thinks one should be telling and actually giving it to the people who know the story, can tell the story. And I had the benefit of going to the Burrup Peninsula a couple of years ago, and the stories that the Indigenous people there were able to tell about the way the sea had moved and the climate change stories, because there were midden sites way up the hill, that's something that as a heritage professional you probably wouldn't have looked at. You just look at the rock art and the engravings, but the full stories about climate change, which is so significant in our society today, will come out. Whether if the heritage experts have been doing the interpretation, that would not probably have been the case. So just wanted to flag that as an example of an interpretation sort of avenue of letting go.
And thank you. And I think that now I'll push you on to we only have time for one more discussion, and that I would focus on dissonant memories. I think this is an important part of the discussion. We're aware that we're more and more aware that there are multiple memories associated with places. And the real question is about how do you deal with dissonant memories? How do you, with competing claims on the same site, for the same site? What processes can we undertake to get through that and to avoid conflict, I suppose? Or maybe we have to acknowledge conflict. I don't know which one of you wants to start. I'm looking at you. Elizabeth, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I can start with this. It might not surprise you to hear, I feel you embrace the conflict. I mean, this is when communities are given the space to come forward with their truth and recognition that each of us might have a different truth, then only then can true dialogue, whether it's about the past or about contemporary challenges, really happen. It is not an easy process, and it is not one that is linear. But when a site is open to multiple memories that are at odds, it gives the community a sense of being heard, and then positions community members to listen. And when people are heard, they're able to begin to pivot and think about the future. And sometimes what we find in environments that are deeply conflicted, it's starting with the challenges that are shared challenges, contemporary shared challenges, as an entry point to think about different paths and different understandings and interpretation. Because in the end, we all are facing challenges in a similar way. We all hope for our children to live a peaceful life. We all have a vision for a future that includes all of our voices. So when you can work backwards, start from that place and work backwards with respect for difference, then that experience and the site at which that experience happens becomes quite powerful. And you'll see community members beginning to gravitate toward that site to have that kind of experience. And yes, it needs to be ideally facilitated, but it starts with, it's grounded in respect for different perspectives and a confidence that together we can work through our differences, starting with our shared experience. So moving from individual narratives to shared experience that brings us together, and ultimately collective visioning and action. That's the change that we often see in this kind of environment.
And how do you bring about that discussion? I'm also curious about the length of time, but how do you bring people together? Who can convene that?
This is, I think, where your partners really come into play. There are always community groups that are people who have come with similar experiences and similar frustrations or similar traumas that they've experienced, and they already are a cohesive group. So starting with that group and beginning to explore their connection to the site and then branching out. I think that we found partnerships to be extraordinarily helpful, and often in deeply, deeply divided societies, it's starting with young people. I think looking at young people and looking at elders, and whether that moves into an intergenerational exploration where young people who perhaps are thinking that these events, these traumatic events actually never even occurred, putting them together with elders and having them record these stories, it starts to create connections that are quite profound. And at the same time, opens minds to experiences that are beyond their imagination. And you start to then create a cohesive community by beginning with difference.
Alwyn, how would you see going about dealing with dissonant memories on the same sites or conflicting memories?
Thank you, Christina. I think the basic premise is the sort of co-production of the histories and stories, and I think Elizabeth has, really articulated very well, her experiences of working with sites of, significant trauma or conflict. For looking at it from a process point of view, I think that, again, interpretation can play a strong part in World Heritage properties. So going back to the idea of an interpretation strategy being identified and the multiple voices associated with a property being identified at that point. I mean, I think what Elizabeth's talked about is the actual doing. And I suppose before the actual doing, we need, in World Heritage, we need a framework within which that can sit. But the inclusion of all stakeholders who are connected to that place, and of course, as Professor Lim has said, there are tangled memories and tangled histories, and all we need to do is look at World War sites where there have been multiple players and multiple histories and memories of those actions and those wars, where if we tried to take one over another, we would be missing the whole story. So I think there needs to be a framework within which this excellent work of storytelling, memory sharing, and reaching a point of common movement forward is really important.
Hello, Professor Lim. You've done a lot of work in Europe, Eastern Europe, and it's quite interesting of the reference to wars. And what would your positioning be on how you would deal with dissonant memories and conflict sites?
Yeah, very recently I had a chance to write a review for the new proposal to restructure Babyn Yar in Kiev, Ukraine. And then to my surprise and to my pleasure, these Ukrainian historians now try to remake Babyn Yar as a really transnational memorial for victims, multinational victims and multi-ethnic victims. So my suggestion is also to make this Babyn Yar as a really the memorial of global memory. But on the other hand, the oxymoron of the global memory space is that it became a playground for competing national memories very often. Before the globalization of memory, people were not interested in what kind of memories do our neighboring nation have. They didn't care. Just they were caring about their own memories. But with the globalization of memory, people began to be interested in the collective memories of their neighboring nations. So, for example, nowadays you may have heard about the conflict over a modern industrialization sites in Japan as a new World Heritage sites between Koreans and Japanese. But for example, 20 years ago, Koreans would not be that much interested in the Japanese World Heritage site. But nowadays, Koreans are also very much interested in the Japanese historical site. It means it shows a very good example that how the world and our memories, our past has been entangled nowadays with the emergence of global memory space. So how to make this new chance that the newly emerging global memory space or global memory formation has brought to us to make a world in a more reconcilable memories. Otherwise, also this the globalization of memory, unfortunately, may have lead us to a very conflictual world of the memory. So I think that in that sense, the outstanding universal values that World Heritage Sites insist from its beginning is very important value for remaking this global memory space into our own really, how can I say, globally open-minded, multi-directional memories. That's what I want to say.
Well, thank you. And I mean, this is a very interesting discussion. We could deepen it a lot. But we are live streaming on YouTube and Facebook, and I have a number of questions that have come in. So I will put some of these questions on the table and see who would like to answer them. People are thanking us for insightful discussion and are very pleased with the discussion. So that's very nice. So first question I have here is whether the discussion about multiple voices, whether that is only valid for World Heritage sites that have already been inscribed. What do you think if the sites with multiple voices are inscribed on the World Heritage sites in the future? So I guess the question there is, will there be a change in the way sites are presented? Because we're all talking about the sites that now exist and have had their outstanding universal value described in a certain way. I don't know if one of you wants to pick that one up. Maybe you, Alwyn.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, it's a good point, and I think what we, as World Heritage professionals, would want to see is that maybe the framework and the processes for World Heritage inscription could change to accommodate the identification of multiple memories in advance of an inscription or a nomination coming forward to the World Heritage Committee. I kind of alluded to that in my discussion about interpretation being a central part of management, and where there is a need for a management plan, perhaps there could be something like an interpretation strategy, noting that not all players will necessarily be identified at that point, but to notice that there is a requirement for multiple voices, and then that and this was actually alluded to by Professor Bill Logan in his lecture in this lecture series preceding this webinar series at the end of last year. He suggested that perhaps the preliminary assessment that will now take place of World Heritage nominations before they get provided to the committee could look at that particular aspect and see whether an interpretation strategy had been provided, and one which would reflect the multiple voices, the entangled memories, and indeed the global memory formation, as Professor Lim has said in that proposal. Thank you.
Another question that's come in, how do you ensure that the telling of multiple narratives happens without passing judgment and pointing fingers, and allows people to make their own conclusions? Is that even possible? Should interpretation be free of bias, since everyone will come to a site with their own memories and experiences? Who would like to take a shot at that one? Probably Elizabeth.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. I think there are a number of ways that you can ensure openness to various perspectives. One is really starting from the understanding that interpretation doesn't, you don't put a pin at a point in time when the interpretation is done. So part of a site's responsibility, I think, is to create space for evolution and understanding, and for the community to come together and in time, in that non-linear process, come to new understandings. It could even be new scholarship that emerges. So recognizing that a site is, the understanding is fluid, and creating space for that in its interpretation. I also think that starting from the place that we must respect multiple perspectives. So in our programs, for example, we have non-negotiables. You can come with your truth, you can talk about your memories and your perspectives, but you need to recognize that you will not insult, and you will not you don't have any right to criticize the perspectives of others in the group. So as a group, you set up your non-negotiables, and then you create a safe space for this discussion. And that can be expanded into the larger interpretation of sites. It starts with a place where we recognize that not everyone's personal truth will be the same. And if you can start with that respect, and create space for the evolution of your understanding, then that goes a long way towards addressing bias. But we always have to be on the lookout for that.
Okay. Professor Lim, would you like to add to that comment? You're unmute. You're muted.
My answer can be combined to the question 3, number 3, and number 4. I mean, you know, as a historian, I have thought that if we overcome national history paradigm, we can live in a slightly different world. But later I found that people are learning history not from professional historians' works, but they are learning history from novels and the films, TV dramas, and the cartoons, and so on. So that's why I began to shift from historian to a memory activist. In a sense, touring to World Heritage Sites and reading certain explanations or historical explanations of these World Historical Sites is very important in making people's memories and people's remembrance. Also, it has a very strong hegemonic power, more than we have thought. So how to represent World Heritage Site to visitors is also very important work to remake our understanding of the past. Thank you.
Here's another question that is very interesting. How does this process interact or intersect with nation-state soft power initiatives? Are there any sites that demonstrate best practices in terms of multiple perspectives interpretation? So, who would like to propose a site or sites that are good practice of multiple perspective interpretation? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the new proposal to restructure the Babinja Memorial in Kiev can be a very good example. It now comprises not only Jewish victims and the Romani victims and the socialist victims and the homosexuals. It carries a memory of multiple memories of the various victims, and without making any hierarchization of those victims. So I think that it can be a very good example for us to show how the 21st century World Heritage Site can be represented.
Mm-hmm. Owen, do you have a favorite?
Not so much with World Heritage specifically, but I think Elizabeth probably would have some really good examples of state-based interpretation, where the multiple narratives are provided, and it brings to mind some material I read about the Derry Museum in Ireland. And where multiple perspectives have been provided in, which essentially, a very difficult conflict with different countries and different religions, but how that interpretation enabled or tried to facilitate a transformative piece of interpretation where people went in perhaps with preconceptions, but because all of the stories were told from different perspectives, and that was allowed within this Derry Museum, that there was the opportunity for a change in perspective of people visiting. So that, I think, sounds as though, I haven't been there myself, but it sounds as though it's a great example, and I'll hand over to Elizabeth. She may have some more views.
Yes, Elizabeth, the last word to you, because then we have to wrap up.
Thank you. Yes, that's the Museum of Free Dairy, and I highly recommend that. They've done a great job of presenting multiple perspectives. And I just have two more examples I'll share. One is not on the World Heritage list, but it's Monte Sole Peace School Foundation in Italy, and they do really an extraordinary job of working, particularly with young people. It was the site of villagers. 700 villagers were killed during World War II. And they bring young people together to talk about the porous line very often between victim and perpetrator. And they really dig into the gray area and what goes into our choices. And that's really an extraordinary site. Then I will also just mention ESMA, the Naval Mechanics School in Buenos Aires in Argentina. They're on the tentative list. And I'll mention them because this is a specific, I think, really wonderful way to go back and look at your interpretation and adjust when you realize that someone's voice is missing. And they realize that in all of their interpretation, this was a site, a Naval Mechanics School. It was also a site of clandestine torture and detention during the dictatorship in Argentina, in the middle of Buenos Aires. And they realized that the women prisoners were missing from the stories that were being shared, from the interpretation inside the museum. And what they did, we provided them with funding, as did a few others, but they actually went and wrote with a marker on each of the interpretive panels the stories of the women that were missing. So on the one hand, you get the stories of the women. On the other hand, you start to see, that was missing all along and we didn't realize it. So I'll just leave you with that example.
Okay, and we have more questions rolling in, but I'm afraid we're out of time. And I'd like to thank all three of you for really very, very interesting comments and experience to share with everyone. And I hope that the session for our audience has contributed to your understanding of the challenges that arise when acknowledging and interpreting multiple memories at World Heritage Sites. And so on behalf of all of us, I would just want to thank Hari Shim, who opened this webinar, and Mr. Kim, who was not here today, but of the Preparatory Office, for their leadership in sponsoring this series on the interpretation of multiple stakeholders' narratives, and also to congratulate the government of Korea to have created the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites. It's going to be a great contribution to the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. So with that, thank you very much. And Hari, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Thank you all so much for Christina, Elizabeth, Jihan, and Owen, and above all, the audiences who watched and participated in the discussion for making this webinar interactive and dynamic. And sorry we had a bit of a bad connection on our YouTube. We'll be uploading our video on our Facebook and YouTube afterwards, so you can watch it again after today. I think today's discussion will lead to the subject of our next webinar, Dissonance on World Heritage, Multiple Voices with Different Memories. Our second webinar will be on air on March 24th through our YouTube and Facebook as well. We'll still have 5 more webinars to come in the first half of this year, so please join our upcoming webinars. We also will launch a short video contest on the theme of reconciliation and peace made through World Heritage. So please share your stories with us about heritage, which had a contested history in the past, but have reconciled peacefully in the process of protection. So thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar in March.